You were just talking about you asked me how my little one was going and it was doing, and then you were talking about your little one and in this new community that you're inside of, right? And you talked about that she's getting it at a gut level, right?
Yeah.
And just this little interaction, right? Of her going to the lake and then going with Ruth, right? Some of the people that you knew and the time spent, that there's something that she's thriving.
Yeah, she's thriving. Yeah, that's the right word. And settling too. Like I can just tell that she's just kind of easier to get along with. Now, part of that might be that Vanessa and I are easier to get along with.
Mm,
Part of it might be that she's just getting older. I mean, she's 5.5. She's not 4, 3, or 2.
mhm.
Um, but her basic needs are met easily.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. It's interesting because this you've been reading or have read the book about recommended by John about relationality, right? The
Yeah.
one being is pure being's ontological ground is pure relation, I think
Yeah.
is something like that.
I can't Fuller, I believe is his name, is the
Yeah,
author. Yeah.
yeah. Not an easy book.
No.
Yet in some sense, what he's pointing out is uh is is quite simple, right? In its essence, right? In fact, in some ways, its very simplicity, i.e., its depth, is part of its its historical obscurity. Let's say, um,
Yeah, well, I think a lot of this is going around these days. Like we said, not an easy book, but the reason why it's not an easy book isn't so much the book as
mhm.
it is the way that it's trying to wrestle our kind of mind
Yeah,
into shape.
yeah,
And
yeah,
that's the hard part. The hard part, I think, is not, as you said, there's something deeply, would you say, did you say deep? Yeah, depth.
hmm
There's depth, and there's a simple depth, and in
yeah,
many ways, an obvious depth, like the kind
yeah,
of thing that you talk to a child about.
yeah,
Um, we're distant from it because of the kind of mind that we've cultivated.
yeah,
Uh, we have to be kind of poured into a new container so that we can perceive the depth and the simplicity,
yeah,
organic, perhaps.
yeah, yeah. Totally. In some sense, I think what we're talking about, right, in this, like your experience of really being in a community, right, going alongside of and inside of your experience with Christianity.
Mhm.
And what I understand, I listened to the first time you talked about it, where you really went through the story about how that came about. Um, and what struck me about that was, in some sense, it sounded to me like when you were implicitly invited to participate, right, through the relation, right, of the of the uh, of the community that was already there, right? When you talked about, like, you spontaneously got in conversation with somebody, like, the first time you went out for a walk or something with the neighbors, and that there was something wholesome about it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, one thing that just came to mind is a conversation I just had, like maybe yesterday or today,
Mm-hmm.
about the collapse of high trust society.
Hmm.
But the key word there is society. And so the frame that I would propose is something like trust is organically part of relationality.
Yeah,
So high trust relationship, and that of course comes through the development and cultivation of the relationship.
yeah,
And what happens is we build high trust relationship in community. Right? So community is composed of high trust relationships and what some folks would call strong bond relationships.
hmm,
And this is very good. This is very beneficial. There's a lot of good things that happen when you have a large, diverse community of strong bonds, high trust.
Yep.
At a certain point, we try to find a way to scale that, and the word scale is particular. In other words, I'm using the same way the Tyson-Yonker Porta distinguishes between growing and scaling.
Yeah.
You can grow relationships by spending time with somebody,
Mm-hmm.
get to know them, they get to know you. Like you weave together at a human level. You can scale something by identifying with a proxy, like a brand or a label.
Yeah.
So, oh, we're both Americans, therefore I don't know you, but I can sort of take this sign or signal that you're part of some kind of identity
Yeah.
as a proxy for real relationship.
Yeah.
And that thing right there, that's society.
Yeah.
And so society is this kind of simulacrum of relationship that we can invest. It can grow on top of a real organic
Yeah.
community relationality, but because it can scale, you can add a lot more people to it.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for a while, that works. For a while, you get this multiplier effect of all these people you can transact with, you can interact with in a high trust basis.
Yeah. Yeah.
But society has a lot of failure conditions because you don't actually know.
Yeah.
And so it creates a niche for people who pretend but parasitize, or
Yeah.
people who are part of it but kind of like cut corners at the edges.
Yeah.
You can't
Yeah.
quite tell because your relationship isn't intimate enough.
Yeah.
So then eventually what happens is there's this arc of the secular degeneracy of society
Yep.
until the high trustness of society begins to decay.
Mm-hmm.
And then the society part starts to fall apart. And that's a collapse, and that's not pleasant. But because the community part is not subject to the same kind of parasitic
Yeah.
and degenerate behaviors, it begins to rise back up and become more
Yeah.
obvious the thing that was the thing we were trying to do in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh God. Yeah. Interesting. Interesting. And would you say that that describes what you're in the midst of right now?
Oh yes, yeah, definitely. But both, by the way, in the sense of community, meaning geographic proximity. So
Mm-hmm.
this is a community of relationship where you get to know people and get in the techniques of getting to know people are available. You could just I was just laughing because one of the things that happens around here, and it definitely didn't happen where in California or even in Texas, as I recall, but that's a very different, distant location, is a neighbor will be driving up, usually in their truck, and
Mm-hmm.
they'll just stop in the middle of the road. And you'll walk up and you kind of lean in the window and you'll chat until one or two things happens. Either your chatting is over or enough traffic is built up behind you that can't go around. That it's like, yeah, you better move on. Um, but these are the psycho technologies of relationship and community. Okay, so there's that on that side, and there's
Yeah.
a process of actually participating, or honestly, in the actual lived context of a place, so that you are growing into it,
Yeah.
and taking responsibility for it, and taking care for it, and learning what that means. Like it has a pace, it has a proper pace.
Yeah.
But over here too, right? This Christianity thing has been deeply, deeply also covered over by becoming more of a society
Yeah.
than a relationality. And
Yeah.
so because somebody has the label of Christian and maybe even goes through some of the principal motions, like they wear a cross on a chain around their neck, they go to church on occasion,
Yeah.
doesn't mean they actually are in relationship with the body of the church or
Right.
with Christ.
Right. Right. Totally. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Because in some sense, I was imagining, in your experience, wasn't it? It was a little bit down the road before you or your wife were invited to go to this church, right?
Right. Yeah.
You've been living for how long?
We first entered into the community,
Yeah.
only 3 months, but it was a long 3 months, like a very rich 3 months. And we had already fallen in love with the community. So we had bought land. We were going to be moving here. This was
Yeah.
definitely happening.
Yeah.
And then, perhaps by providence,
Yeah.
Vanessa is invited to come into the church to
Yeah.
visit the physical church.
Yeah. Totally. I was just imagining that if that invitation came on like day two, that you were there, right? What that would have what that would have been like, right? How you would have experienced versus 3 months into it,
Oh yeah,
right?
absolutely. Yeah, it would have. I would have definitely been. I would have said no. I mean, I would have been hesitant. I wouldn't have said no, but I
Yeah,
would have said no. Like that's not who I am. This isn't going to work. Like that, something like that. Like it wouldn't have felt attractive.
yeah,
But so deeply fallen in love with the community and gotten to so many locations or moments of epiphany of like discovering that ideas and notions that we had brought in
yeah,
were off, not radically wrong, but off. Like, oh, okay, we were a little confused. Now we get it.
right.
Uh, that the invitation was almost like we're getting an invitation from the whole place as
Yeah,
well as it was a single person.
yeah, yeah. That's just really, to me, that's just really striking, right? About the whole thing. Um, because one of the things that is I think I mentioned to you, like I've been going to the Eastern Orthodox Divine Liturgy. Unfortunately, a lot of my weekends I'm teaching,
Mm.
so I haven't been able to go like every single week, and I've been doing that, and I've been reading, I should say, rereading Meister Eckhart. This,
Oh,
yes,
it looks perfect with the background.
actually perfect with the background, right? Every morning with my coffee and reading like a sermon, and
Nice.
and in some sense been engaging in the wrestling, right? With um in some sense it's really strange because it's a wrestling with on one level like the modernization of my presuppositions, right? My, let's say, secular humanist self, right? All the things that like I don't even have to think about to stand on in order to think things, right?
Yeah.
At some level, the roots of all those are Christian. Yet some turn in modernity that happened, right? All of a sudden makes when you explicate, right, those presuppositions and make them something aspirational, right? Then all the allergies, right, kind of come up, which is just a strange thing, right? Like,
Mm, interesting.
um, and this, and it's interesting because my experience has been like how I've been viewing this, like going to church and doing those kinds of things, is when I think of religion as a virtue, all I notice, all like being religious as a virtue, and I mean by the real sense of virtue, which is it
Yeah.
brings you always beyond, right, something beyond itself, right, that sense of a virtue. I notice all of my secular humanistic worries just go away. Like it's because there's something about like, and I kind of sense this when you read the description of Jesus, right, and the interactions in the Gospels. I get this same kind of sense with Christ when you just kind of like listen to the way that he interacts with people. And my sense of that, anyways, is that there's something about being religious as a virtue, right? That somehow presences um, something beyond what I can totally understand, but calls to me. And I think, and in some sense, I think about everything that I would then believe, everything I would participate in, right, would be an expression of an on the way to this virtue versus something that I go and become a member of, or I belong to, or I adopt a belief or something like that. There's something that happens to it when I consider religion as a virtue that I just notice a lot of my allergies and my my modernistic concerns and stuff kind of just evaporate.
Okay, well, there's two things that come up for me there. So see if I'm hearing you right.
Yeah.
And they're distinct as far as I can tell, but I'm sure there's a really beautiful way they connect. So the first, when I hear the phrase religion as a virtue, um, I hear something along the lines of discipleship, right?
Hmm.
So more along the lines of becoming,
Yeah.
along the lines of becoming one in a particular way. And
Yeah.
so um, practices with a direction, like literally like soccer practice or basketball practice, become
Yeah.
a better, right? So it's becoming better and
Yeah.
better at.
Yeah.
And in some sense, then to be imbibing and metabolizing the
Yeah.
material of virtue,
Yeah.
so that virtue becomes a natural extension of character, not a thing you're trying to do.
Yeah.
The first part I hear, which
Yeah.
of course, or if you think about that just from the point of view of like the anxiety of trying to, like when you first learn how to ride a bike, when you're first learning how to ride a bike or drive a car,
Yeah.
you know, anxiety of when you're trying to do it through the wrong faculty,
Yeah.
or to drive a car by remembering how to drive a car,
Yeah.
as opposed to having simply imbibed to become quite good at it, and it's a natural capacity, then you're very relaxed. You can just express that functionality into the world, in some sense effortlessly. In fact, so effortlessly that you can do other stuff, right? You can drive a car and talk about things, drive a car and think about where you're going to go. Let's not text while we're driving. The other side, yeah, the other side. Let's do this. This will be fun. I've been really, really playing with the notion of faith. Now,
Hmm.
you may have, if you watched my conversation with Jim Wright, you would have heard me talking about that particular piece, but I can recapitulate it pretty easily.
Okay.
It was both a certain portion of the mostly American or Western Protestant Christians, as well as very much so the secular critics of Christianity, um, have, from my point of view, wrongly um, identified the word faith to be a certain kind of, let's say, belief of ideas, propositional concepts,
Yeah.
and the particular flavor being like maximally delusional. And so faith is the willful belief in things in spite of all available evidence, something like
Yeah.
that,
Yeah. Yeah.
absent any possible evidence. So that's like faith is like this residuum of or resistance against evidence.
Yeah.
And I think that's actually completely wrong. Not like a little bit wrong, but like categorically wrong.
Hmm.
And I'm, by the way, I've been doing some chat GPT and Claude assisted Greek etymologies of the actual words in scripture that where these things come up. I actually studied Greek for a few years, so I've got a background in it, but chat GPT is real helpful to verify that what I'm saying here is not
Yeah.
off the cuff, but is say biblical. But the what I think is the deepest sense, or at least a very deep sense of faith, is it's the substrate below understanding.
Yeah.
It's
Yes.
the yeah. So because it's below understanding, it's not the kind of thing that we can name or talk about. It's more fundamental than naming and talking about.
Yeah.
Um, but therefore, for example, ways that we can think about it is that this competence that you develop in driving,
Yeah.
if you come to a place where you understand, I'm going to make a layer like faith, understanding, expression, or the ability to talk about.
Yeah.
Right? So if I understand something, I can talk about it with a certain fluidity.
Hmm.
But before I can understand it, I have to actually cultivate faith in this context.
Yeah.
I have to
Yeah.
cultivate something like an intimacy with the reality,
Yeah.
the whole reality, right?
Yeah.
Not the reality that I can grasp or perceive, but the actual reality. I imagine like an invisible door. I
Yeah.
can't see it, but if I can touch it, I begin to come into relationship with it with intimacy, and then I can grasp the handle and I can turn the handle and the door opens. Okay, I've developed a competency with this thing that I cannot otherwise perceive with my eyes, which I
Yeah.
know the
Yeah.
door.
Yeah.
And this goes all the way down, like developmentally, right? The capacity of an infant to become capable of distinguishing colors and patterns and faces, and then identifying certain faces, or to be able to reach out and notice that hands are part of self, and that you can articulate hands to grab something and then eat something. Like this is, I would say, faith is the substrate, the underlying most fundamental thing that binds together the the fabric of relationship.
Yeah.
Right? That faith is the fabric. Is faith is another word for how relationship grows. Right?
Yeah.
How relationship grows and becomes larger and larger wholes that are embodied in a certain way. So
Yeah.
that's like a very, very deep, deep notion.
Yeah.
And so then you can put in any context of understanding, when I developed actually embodied competency,
Yeah.
that's understanding. And then there's the sort of intellectual mental mapping of that understanding to some kind of mode of expression that I can share.
Yeah.
So that's
Yeah.
expression on top. And that might be words, it might be pictures, it might be any other a mode of expression. But the point is it crosses the boundary from myself to the exterior.
Yeah.
Um, and notice how that links to the previous point around virtue in terms of character. Like
Yeah.
it's when you've cultivated faith in a certain context.
Yeah.
Um, in a moment, we'll do faith in God as kind of like the super case of that.
Yeah.
Because it's so natural, right? Because it's actually real competence in relationship with the reality that you're interacting with. Two things happen. One is you're at the maximum degree of ease. It's the easiest possible way to navigate the thing you're trying to do,
Yeah.
particularly because you're not trying to do it up here.
Yeah.
And it's the best that you could do given who you are at that moment, right? So there's also a
Yeah.
really combination of full commitment
Yeah.
uh, and the easiest path simultaneously.
Yeah. Yeah. And almost I get the sense of like there's something diagnostical there
Say
as
more.
well. Just that sense of relaxing into something, finding yourself participating, right, at this deep phenomenological layer, right? Approaching reality as this, not that you can see through it. It's actually kind of invisible in some sense, but it's reachable. And then that reaching discloses more, and that disclosure you're already inside of, right? In some sense. So it's this kind of bottom up, top down sweet spot in a way. But kind of a sense of like it seems like as the invisible, right, but most intimate reality that's disclosing itself, right, as it discloses itself, it also discloses you in some sense. That's what I that's
Oh,
what
interesting. Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way, but that's very nice. So yeah. Okay, so try this. This is another fun one.
Mhm.
Um, it turns out, I'll say it that way, that the word, so the famous Paul, faith is assurance in things hoped for, something like that, or
Mhm.
confidence in things hoped for,
Yeah, faith is an assurance or confidence in things hoped for. Okay.
or things unseen.
Yeah.
So the Greek, the actual word that he uses for
Yeah.
assurance is hypostasis.
Hmm.
Now, this word is also the word that is translated as persons. So when we look at like the persons of the Trinity,
Yeah.
hypostasis. By the
Huh.
way, it's also the word that is used to translate the hypostatic union in Christ as all God and all man. Like, well, how's that happen with the hypostatic union?
Yeah.
So ostensibly, these are three very different kinds of things, but it's the same word. So then, okay, there are different tones of some very particular kind of thing. And when you the way you said it just then, that notion that it discloses itself and discloses you to yourself.
Yeah.
This is what happens in a relationship between persons.
Yeah.
That's what
Yeah.
happens in a personal relationship is this reciprocal opening, this thing
Yeah.
that where in conversation, in relationship, there's something that is an intimacy about that I develop in relationship with you. But in so doing, I simultaneously disclose intimacy in myself. That's the only way of doing it.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And have an awareness of that as it's mirrored back to me. And so faith is, I think, that kind of thing. Right? So we're starting to get some really beautiful things that are seeing at the very lowest levels.
Yeah. It just, would you say that in some sense, kind of marking that difference of like if you were invited to church like on day two, versus when you were invited after participating, right? In within this kind of mutual participatory a reality that you couldn't quite see, but you could feel into, and it was disclosing itself.
Yeah.
In some sense, when that is like, would the invitation from the person who invited you would be something like, would that be like the maybe the propositional level that reached in, right? And that faith is in some sense uh, that in that moment, see that one of the things I thought about, like if it was me, like in that experience, I would be struck by not only, right, not only is possibly going to church attractive to me, right, but actually I'd be struck by the me that would actually be attracted to it,
Hmm.
right? In some sense, I'd be surprised. I'd be surprised at
Sure.
finding myself, and I think this is what you're kind of alluding to, is you find yourself in a like being someone who's already begun in some sense, right?
Yeah. 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 For sure.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Is
Yeah.
that
So,
what that would be a good example of these different kind of levels that you drew out?
yeah. Yeah. So the example is got that's a very fine point because in this particular case, if you recall, um, the first moment was I was invited by a friend to a kid's birthday party at a house where I didn't know the family at the house. Okay. So it'd be like if you invited me to somebody you knew, but I didn't know them at all.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
a kid's birthday party.
yeah,
And so the identity, me, right, a version of identity that I had cultivated up until that moment or up until relatively recently said, like, was like, that doesn't make any sense. Like, how could that be a thing that you could do?
yeah.
This new
Yes.
identity that was in the process of becoming says, why not, man? I mean, something seems right about it. And the fact that it doesn't make sense, we now know that a lot of things that are true don't make sense on the basis of who we have been.
Hmm.
So it seems like we should just keep going. Like it's working.
Yeah, to see seems
Yeah, seems
seems
exactly.
right. Seems. I think that maybe that's that. I think that word does that word. It strikes me as it demarcates that point of the way that you said it. That point where I contact reality, right, and it's not. I can't see into it, but it's a such that I can feel into it, and that so that in some senses does that would that contact point
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like seeming.
yep, totally. So to say it, to use the language from a moment ago, it would be faith that my burgeoning faculty for navigating by means of faith is telling me that this is a good idea. Seems.
Yeah,
And I'm increasingly able to trust that and make choices on the basis of that,
yeah,
and increasingly able to be liberated from the trap of these frameworks of what is or is not an appropriate behavior. And
yeah,
by framework, I mean framework specific, like an ideology or a paradigmatic structure, like very much a mental overlay put on top of behavior to try to constrain behavior in a simulation of virtue.
yeah, 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 yeah. Interesting. Real. This is it's really so I'm noticing, right, as we're talking about this, um, like everything's gotten really like fleshy. Like
Mm.
now flesh, right? There's distinct things that are in contact with each other. There's an opening, and it's got
Mm-hmm.
an elemental feel, like a feeling of there's something thrilling about it, right? There's something ecstasis about it, right? Just about in going into this, and it becoming alive, which I'm just appreciating. And it's one of the things that I want to kind of bring this in here because it's one of the things that Eckhart, in many ways, right, addresses in this. And one of the things about these sermons is it's really cool because he's basically taking like hardcore Neoplatonism, like apophatic, like like the highest level of Christian mysticism, right, that you can imagine, and and putting it in farmer language. He's speaking to
Mm.
farmers, right, essentially, and and so literally, like it's a he kind of walks you into, in some sense, these abstractions, these the highest levels of abstractions, and then just brings it down into these ways of talking about it. And so something about the morning and like just timing it just right with the coffee, right? And
Mm.
being outside and like all of it just kind of comes together and really, really ends up, I end up carrying it throughout the day in a lot of ways. But one of the things, one of the big ones for me, and I wanted to talk with you about this and a couple of things, because one of the things I wanted to talk to you about, I wanted to talk with you about that's been a real mystery for me is this sense of God on one level being the ineffable, right? The apophatic,
Uh-huh.
and and simultaneously a person.
Hmm.
There's something, in fact, three persons,
Hmm.
right? Like, and this in the sense of where in one of the things that uh in the Orthodox tradition, like first of all, I don't understand hardly any of it, right? I read a book on it and explained all of it, and I still don't understand it. There's everyone singing everything, right? If there's a level of harmony and resonance that like that comes in that even though I can't put, I don't have the propositional understanding of it, right? There's something that's really communicated. But then
That's probably proper. Like what my sense of things is that you're not supposed to, or to endeavor to grasp it by means of propositional understanding is
yeah,
either completely wrong or impossible.
yeah, yeah, totally. Well, especially the first time I went because I didn't realize behind me there was gathered a whole chorus of women upstairs in a room that I didn't see, and it was all the men singing at first, right? And then in somewhere up an hour into it, this ah, and it just went boom, right? I was not expecting that. My heart opened and I was
Mm.
crying and then the and but then there's this part where it's you could say the formality pauses for a moment and the priest, I don't know if you call the priest, but the head guy
I think
kind of
priest.
pauses and he just raps with you about something. Like what you would think about as a normal sermon, but it's only for about 5-10 minutes. But man, sandwiched inside of all of that, when it's like you are just attuned. So whatever he says just goes really, really deep. And I've noticed everything that he's talked about like lingers in me in this other deep way. And the first time what he talked about is I don't remember the book. I don't remember what quote it was, but he was talking about this someplace in the Bible where Jesus was talking about the commandments, and he was saying something about like essentially the gist of it, at least what I heard was really the first one. If you do the first one all the way, you don't have to even focus on the rest of them because they'll just be kind of natural blossoms out of you.
Mhm.
And the first one being love God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul. And the sense of it was, and I think kind of the point I heard Jesus making, right, was look, if you think you're going to get there just by transactionally following the rules, that kind of misses the point. Like you have to, in some sense, fully give it over. Like, and
Right.
what giving it over is falling in love, right, with that which in some way is completely ineffable, right? There's a real challenge there. And and that if you do that, all of Christianity will just unfold, right? Like if that's where you're coming from, the whole thing will be in some sense that was the spirit of what I heard.
Hmm.
So there's that sense of this personal relationship with God, right? That is in some sense ineffable, right? And then alongside of this, right? which is this other thing that Eckhart spoke of. And he said that, like, look to the like none of the soul's power can reach, can know God, right? In this, in the way that you know a thing.
Right.
However, there are some things that there's a couple of powers that can basically reveal the unknowability of God to you, right? And he said one is desire and the other is intellect, right? And what was striking to me about this is he says that desire prompts intellect, right? That desire is closer to God than the intellect. And that really struck me, right? That really, really struck me. And I think that there's something about this that you're talking about with faith, right?
You know, another term that I've really been playing with is I learned in relationship to the Orthodox guys is beauty first
Hmm.
rather than truth first,
Yeah,
which connects very nicely to desire trumps the intellect.
yeah,
Which is not to say, by the way, that not truth never. It's just beauty first, then truth second.
yeah,
And yeah, the notion of, let's see, hold on. So yeah, the nature of desire is the nature of intimacy, the nature of relationality, right? The call of desire is to come into communion. That's the hope of desire, is to actually not just to touch the other, but to commingle with the other.
yeah,
Whereas the nature of the intellect imports a certain intrinsic separation. Right?
yeah,
The hope of the intellect is to come into to to conform around, right? To grasp,
yeah,
and grasping and communion are the same thing. And
yeah,
so if we can find ourselves and okay, so then the this then also helps resolve the antinomy of ineffability and relationality. Is
yeah,
it funny? I actually have your face like this notion of the calling forth, like the always receding,
yeah,
the calling forth towards God um, has simultaneously the characteristic of a real intimacy. Right? You can come into a real relationship with the persons and has an infinite regress. Right? It's a non-finite relationality. You can keep going in a deeper and deeper and deeper level with no reason to believe that would ever. In fact, for sure, it will never end.
yeah,
Uh, it
yeah,
is at the fabric of eternity. It is not just like how do you say plausibly. It is in fact of the fabric of eternity. So for sure, will never end.
yeah,
And and then of course, think about what that means. Right? That means that the intellect's hope for understanding will always be frustrated, right? Because
yeah,
there will be no sort of moment at which the thing is fully encircled and grasped and you're done.
yeah,
But desire's hope for intimacy
yeah,
will be always inflamed, right? It'll be brought further and further because it's every moment you're getting closer and closer into relationship with God is a richer, deeper, more powerful, more life-giving relationship,
yeah,
and always more, right? So these two are so different in their relationship with that particular uh, antimony.
yeah, 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 yeah,
I should mention, by the way, that from my point of view, the way I've come to
yeah,
understand the this challenge of ineffability and personhood is part of why there's a necessity of the incarnation.
hmm,
That even in the simple version, like I think I may have mentioned, looking at your pictures, the simple version is that you can't draw a picture of the Father.
yeah,
The Father moves more in the direction of the pure, of the ineffable.
yeah,
That's not the, it's not that the Father's ineffable and the Son's not, but the Father is more sort of in that direction. Whereas the Son, by being incarnate, by literally being a physical body like us, that
yeah,
has smells a certain way and has a certain tone of voice, embodies so much more
yeah,
possibility of ordinary relationality that you get this. This gives you that kind of connective tissue, which is why that's the way.
yeah,
Uh, you can say the same thing, by the way, about the logos. And if we think about it as from the point of view of the incarnation of Jesus Christ, or we think about it as the logos or the word of God, we notice that that's the same kind of thing. That the logos is the fabric of materiality
Yeah.
It's the thing that can be shared that affords the possibility of relationality.
Yeah. 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 And this mark of the seeming, right? Like it's really striking me when you said seeming, right? Oh, this seems like, although intellectually, right? Like, what am I going to do at a stranger's kid's birthday party at da 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 da, right? You had been on this in some sense finding yourself, right, involved in these relationships, right, that were giving you something at a not below the level of propositional level, right,
Mhm.
that like you could now there's it sounds like it's at one level there's a difference with like at the propositional level you're like, why would I want to go with that, why would that even make sense, but you can feel this other thing being in contact with something else that came across as a seeming, right? That seems okay, this seems good. I don't know why. In fact, this is kind of counter to what I would normally do, but apparently I may not be who I thought I was in all respects. And here we go to the to the party. And that being a kind of faith is what you're saying
Yeah.
is is really striking because it does have this element of like, yeah, this seems the case, right? Or this seems what I want to do. Like there's some kind of level of where it feels very connected to like I'm finding myself desiring what I don't understand, right? And on
Right.
some, right?
Mhm. So now I think would be really good would be to throw in this phrase, faith in God,
Yeah. Yeah.
right? So
Yeah.
it's interesting because just uttering the phrase, it reactivates what I'm arguing is the wrong way of thinking about it, which is,
Yeah.
oh, I have ideas about God and then I believe them very strongly.
Yeah.
Ideas about something which can't possibly be true, and I therefore believe them even more strongly. But obviously, first, I'm arguing that that's completely wrong way of thinking about it. But in this case, we can really start to like build it out. So think about faith in God through the lens of communion,
Yeah.
right? So it's the capacity for this faculty, faith, that emerges in relationship as a consequence of relationship with God.
Yeah.
It's kind of like me and God working together have a different capacity for faith than me working alone.
Yeah.
So in God is not that I have I believe in this concept called God,
Yeah.
but rather I am cultivating a relationship with God, which relationship affords a new capacity for faith in itself.
Yeah. Yeah.
The phrase "the easy yoke" is one that I've sort of begun to use a lot. This is an invitation that Christ says, I'm inviting into an easy yoke, meaning you're yoked, like you and I are now connected, which is to say in communion.
Yeah.
But it's an easy yoke because you're now benefiting from the fact that, for example, I have infinite faith. I am actually this, the essence of potency, sovereignty, and understanding, and I am in relationship with you from a point of view of perfect care. And so you're going to be carrying a little bit, but I'm going to be carrying a lot. But that's kind of how this deal works.
Right. 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 Okay.
So it's a
Yeah.
little bit like, have you ever taken a dance class?
Yeah. Yes.
And so you've got like the teacher or the,
Yeah.
the instructor, and you're dancing with your partner, like your wife or whatever, and you're both in you're novices, so you're whatever, you're mediocre or maybe even just poor. Like there's a lower level, which is to say that your faith, this embodied capacity that is below understanding, in the function of dance is low.
Mm. Mm.
But then when you're dancing with the instructor you have faith in the instructor, which is to say that the relationship itself is the thing that is bringing the necessary faith in the context of dance, and it goes way up.
Yeah.
You do things in the relationship with the instructor that you couldn't do on your own, or you couldn't do with your wife, because the instructor has tremendously more faith in the context of dance. The instructor holds dance with impeccability and fluidity. And because of that, your easy yoke with the instructor is you kind of like surrender and allow the instructor to guide you. And your body is now able to absorb something that you otherwise couldn't absorb. And you're doing stuff, which of course your mind has nothing to do with. So just take that same metaphor and extend that to the point of now your instructor is the the infinite and the eternal,
Yeah.
and the true sovereign of the universe, who also is, like the instructor in this case, fully committed to cultivating in you faith in relationship with life.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. 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 And there's something at the level of this, this, this right listening to the instructor,
Mm-hmm.
right? Just crawling inside of that for a moment. Like, because as we all know, right, that listening can be confused, right?
Yeah.
There's many different things that can become instructors for us, and they're not all always going to go in that direction, right?
Well, that's an important piece too. We can hold that out here, but there's a whole conversation there for sure.
Yeah, yeah. And this, it's interesting because I've now been thinking about this because people, for me, like oftentimes I'll get asked the question about like how I got into started reading philosophy, which I've never been satisfied with my answer to it, right? Until I started to think about it in terms of like I think it's because um for better or for worse, right? My curiosity so outreached my IQ, right? And and that it's really been oh, and I've always kind of felt this because it's not like because I'm intellectually inclined that I was attracted to abstractions or something like that.
Uh-huh.
It was much more at the level of desire, right? But yet a desire that was compelling me in directions that my mind had to like tolerate reading things I couldn't understand, but what kept me going was something was speaking to me that I could desire without understanding. And in some sense, my understanding, right, like it has been catching up, called the understanding of what they were saying and what they were getting, but it always led me in this way. And in some sense,
Uh-huh. Yeah. Nice.
right, in some sense, like this, the dance instructor felt present to that, right, is present in that way. And then the attaining of the understandings, right, and the building up of understandings that I could sit on top of and read more of these things and that thing is still going on. But it's like
Yeah.
all that stuff is not the reason that it was beyond the reason of that, right? In some way. Yeah. So there's just a sense of because this is where the mystery is that attuning one's desires or from the right from the right horizon, if you will.
Nice. Yeah. Very good. So yeah, I have been thinking of this a lot recently in the context of the powers and principalities,
Yeah.
or in a phrase that I used to use, egregores, or we could say spirits or horizons. Um, and I think the way of putting it might be something like, it's funny, like if your primary relationship is the far horizon, the farthest horizon, right? That which is the highest, that which is the the highest possible expression of the virtues in their sort of most perfect hierarchy, and which has as an intrinsic characteristic um, perfect faithfulness and perfect care towards you. Right? So if that's your sort of your primary relationship, um, then that can help you properly order all of the other relationships.
Yeah.
Um, you can think, by the way, just use the embodied example of the dance instructor. In the context of dancing, you might also find yourself sexually attracted to the dance instructor.
Yeah.
And so you find yourself, your passions orienting in a direction which is not the lesson. Like the lesson is not sexual attraction. The lesson is learning how to dance
Yeah.
for the purposes maybe of you brought with it with your wife.
Yeah.
Um, But if you have an orientation towards, well, in the case quite specifically God,
Yeah.
then God will help you separate out what is the wheat and the chaff in this context. Like, oh, okay, while sexual attraction may be coming up, I can now recognize that that's actually not part of what's happening properly in this relationship and take just the part that's supposed to be happening. So each of the subsidiary relationships can play their proper role because there's an orienting basis that helps
Yeah.
separate signal from noise and that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally.
And this, I think, is very, very much at the center of the chaos of modernity.
Right.
That by turning off the primary relationship,
Yeah.
then you're basically in one of two locations. You either have identified another primary relationship because it's not the best possible one, it's going to be creating some kind of errors, or you're going to be engaging in something like chaos, like
Yeah.
something very disordered and fundamentally, like, yeah, fundamentally disordered.
Yeah.
And you can see that playing out. You can see the inertia that we entered into. This is increasingly an obvious part of the narrative, that because we had moved out of Christendom, we had moved out of a established, grounded, well-ordered construct, even though still, of course, embodied with sin in every direction.
Mhm.
Um, but when we moved into the Enlightenment, we moved into modernity, we inherited that inertia, and we inherited the architectures and the hierarchies and the narratives. And we had stories about what the virtues were. We had stories about how the virtues, oriented. And for the most part, everybody was still sort of like dancing to that tune.
Yeah.
But once you unplug it, you unmoor it from its orienting basis, then the dual forces of chaos and idolatry will begin to bleed in.
Yeah.
And over a relatively short period of time, at the end of the day, the secular degeneracy just begins to take over the whole thing.
Yeah. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Totally. And one of the things, in my own wrestling with this, right, like has been, and I think there's something about, so this sense, so the sense of what a self is, right,
Mm.
in my understanding of Christianity is really, really different, right, in this way that kind of in some sense, this the self at its most optimum place in Christianity is a self-emptying.
Kenosis, I believe.
Yeah, yeah,
Something like
yeah, totally. And it's funny. It's one of the places where, and of course that's very connected to other power, right? This kind of notion of that, and Eckhart like names this in a bunch of different ways, that like if there's good going on, it's not coming from you. It's coming from thou, right? It's coming from God. And that in some sense, the function of the self, right, is one of most optimally is when it's become a room making for more and more other, right? This being God.
mm,
And I think that's one of the things where it's like I feel like worked, like my mind is really worked over with that one, right? And I think it's like I feel this kind of, okay, moving in that direction, and then I'm finding myself stepping into some other presupposition of myself, right? Trying to think of that. And there's something that keeps snapping back, right? And I think it's this sense of the self being the kind of modern notion of self being, it has potential, that when you do good, right, it's because you've grown and developed and self-actualized or something, right? Where the it's reversed in some way. That sense of potentiality of self
yeah,
is,
it's so tricky.
yeah, it's really tricky. And of course it's a paradox because in some sense, there's a deep Christian non-duality in that self-emptying other power, right? That it's like the moment that you let go is the moment that you're more and more in union, right? So in some sense, this losing yourself is finding a self that is fine, and in some sense, finding a self, and that self being God, right? In some way.
Well, yes, and God loves you.
Yep.
So in that relationship, God seeks for you to most fully become who you are. Right?
Yeah.
That's the most beautiful thing. You can, in the easiest course of examples, your relationship with your child.
Yeah.
You delight in the reality that your child is in fact something. Right? There's something there. It's not nothing. It's the opposite of nothing. It's pure somethingness. And there's a unique quality you can feel. Like when you feel, I don't know. I've certainly had this experience where, as my children have gotten older, when they are on their path, whether or not I personally have any, like I value their path as a path, is irrelevant. What I can feel is it's actually quite profound as like a moral lesson of, oh, yeah, that's something that as a thing to do.
Yeah.
I don't personally have any connection with it, but holy cow, do I feel the degree to which it's you're on your path, and that is of infinite value.
Yeah. Yeah.
So much so, even more so for God, right? Because God can in fact value the thing itself, and it's in the highest, but even more so this unfolding of you, his child, in that growth direction. Right.
Yeah.
So it's simultaneous. I would say it's like the highest realization of this notion of non-duality, and simultaneously its most complete opposite or rebuke.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Totally. Totally.
Hold on. There was something you were saying when you were saying it earlier. Let me see if I can get back there. Can't quite, but the key is something. Well, we have metanoia, right?
Yeah.
Which is again, that's the Greek word that is often translated as repent.
Yeah.
Um, but the point of metanoia, right, if you just think about that as a word, um, this is much. Sorry, that's not going to be very helpful. This is much closer to the thing we're actually called to do. But the point is something like you were describing. There's a you over here that has a certain set of presuppositions and a certain way, more important, a certain way.
Yeah.
And the invitation is actually, this is the actual you
Yeah.
here. And what we want to do is we want to metanoia. We want to turn from here, from this direction, which is taking you further from the way, to
Yeah.
this direction, which is taking you more in the right direction.
Yeah.
And at the bottom of that, by the way, is in fact a simple on or off. Like you are either heading away from God or towards God.
Mhm.
You're either choosing to head away from God, you're choosing to head towards God. The very, very bottom of that is a very straightforward, like on or off. But as you begin to move towards God, then there's a lot more, not on or offness, but now the nuance and this and the subtlety and the richness starts to unfold.
Yeah.
Um, Yeah, and the reason why I keep coming back to that and trying and struggling with it is you and I are both in this place of metanoia, like we're both in this place of having chosen a particular, like, okay, I'm facing towards God now,
Mhm.
and there's a whole bunch of stuff that is this, this old identity that is still trying to kind of be used. And so
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand the
Right.
ineffable. Oh, wait, hold on, that's not the right thing. I don't understand it. Instead,
Yeah.
allured into it and you become intimate in relationship with it. And
Yeah.
so all these kind of shifts are a change, but it is in fact not just becoming a new person, but I would say properly to become a person. I've really been really deeply like diving that. Like the notion is that as an image bearer of God, right? This story of Adam, to become an image bearer is to have the hypostatic principle, right? To have the capacity to become a person at all.
Yeah.
So here in this direction, what you're doing is you're moving away from being a person. And
Yeah.
over here, you're connecting with the principal underlying personhood and then be developing into personhood, which
Yeah.
contains this beautiful
Yeah.
paradox
Yeah.
of in the process of developing into personhood, you simultaneously
Yeah.
become more and more uniquely who you are.
Yeah.
And become more and more fully emptied out into intimate relationship with God,
Yeah, 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 yeah,
which is the relationships of the Trinity.
yeah.
Like the three persons of the Trinity have that intrinsic relationship with each other.
Right, right,
Perfect.
right, right. Totally. And it strikes me that in some sense, this being the image bearer, right? And in some sense, to become a person, right? And as the image bearer, I am that to become the person, right?
Mhm.
That even the, it strikes me that the way that I stray from that, right? Even that stray is given by this this image bearing, right?
Mhm.
Like even that stray is in some sense always in a kind of relation with, right? This um ability to become a person, right? And
Mhm.
in some way. Like,
Yeah, my daughter put it very beautifully about 4 or 5 months ago. We're just sitting and she said, Daddy, do you know why sometimes I'm bad? I said, no, why are you bad sometimes? She goes, because I'm trying to learn. And I
yeah,
was like, wow, that's
that's
awesome. Yeah, that's right and profound and wow.
yeah, that is profound. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And so yeah, and that trying to learn, right? And in some sense her finding herself already trying to learn, right? Already in some way, um something's already present for her which has her even try to learn or attracted to learn, right?
Yeah.
And in some sense that's the this discovery of this really elusive to propositions, right, sense of what's calling to me, right, seems to be it seems to be very connected to this inexhaustible horizon, right? This recede, as you're talking about, this receding back yet coming forward, right? Like in this inexhaustible sense that, yeah, it's very, very much like, yeah, and I can get that sense of where, you know, it, in some way, you're it seems like that there's something in here about the development of there's a certain kind of development of your capacity to desire the right thing, right?
Hmm.
There's a truing up here, right? Of like it's not just like I think that we normally think about it, which is like there's an object out there, there's a me over here, and then I desire that object, right? And therefore I go towards that object. There's something else going here where it's like as you go along, right? It's like what you actually desire becomes more and more attuned to something that's beyond, like in some senses, beyond any object that you can desire. And
Hmm.
tuning into those little hints or those little truing up of like the perfecting in some sense of desire itself, right? This continually desiring the more true thing, the more beautiful thing, right? Um, and yeah, and kind of going back to this kind of really fleshful notion of faith, this this pre propositional sense of faith, right? Yeah, because I think that there's always, for me, there's this kind of quality of when I get closer to it, right? There's always this felt sense of, it's like on one level there's a discovery of something new,
Mhm.
right? But I kind of there's also this sense of remembering that comes with it. It's
Oh, well, let's play with that. Play with that word because remembering
yeah,
and union.
yeah,
And so there's actually something like a journey towards a coming together with the divine. I think is, so it's a, as you move, as you discover something new, like as you cultivate a capacity to distinguish the good and the beautiful,
yeah,
and then and that cultivation of capacity then also brings forth a relationship and a perception and an imbibing of that higher good and higher beautiful. You grow closer to God
mm,
in communion,
yeah,
which is to say you remember with God.
yeah,
And I think this is actually not a little bit of wordplay. I think
yeah,
that's actually what we mean when we actually really think about the notion of remember.
yeah,
It very much has to do with bringing parts together. Like
yeah,
there's a part that has been apart, and that
yeah,
part has been rediscovered in its relationships that allow it to become part of something which is now a whole. It has been reintegrated, has been atoned, right, at one with something, and that is a remembering. So it's
yeah,
an integration of something into self in a way that is, in some sense, a growth of self into a version of something that is of the fabric of the eternal, not the fabric of the temporal.
yeah,
It
yeah,
hit that right there. Like if you really sit on that, of like a big part of this is all about reorienting your center in the
yeah,
eternal rather than the temporal or the chronological. And
right.
so if we by default imagine or try to think of the faculty of memory as a chronological function,
Hmm.
then it's okay. Oh, it's like recall, something like that. Something in a chronological past that
Mm,
I'm bringing forward into this chronological present.
yeah,
If we center ourselves on the eternal,
yeah, verticality. Yeah,
right, verticality, exactly, then what's happening is remember, meaning there is a higher verticality. Like you're literally coming to a higher tone of verticality where this piece of self is actually being reintegrated into self. You're being membered together into
yeah,
a higher, up closer, right? More towards the infinite, more towards the infinite in the context of the eternal. Wee, tricky.
yeah, yeah, totally. There's something, this brings this um vertical sense of remembering. Um, it's like there's I was thinking about this in terms of, I think it was um Heideggerian scholar talked about this sense of origin, right? He says it's like origin in the vertical sense of the word, right, is not something that was before happened before everything else, but it's that thing that always already arrives first, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and in some sense, the origin, right, is always it's always ahead of you in some way. You're always coming to the origin in this sense. And, one of the things, I just got back from Maui, and I took with me the book, um, the Visible and Invisible, which is Mircea Ponte's book that he died in the middle of, so he never finished it. But it really like, as I was like on the beach reading it, it really struck me, having also just read, and on my second reading of this other book about relationality, right? Which is essentially really has he's kind of in some sense truing up the verticality of that
Yeah.
relation, right?
Yeah.
And it struck me that, like, this, what Ponte doing is in some sense is taking that verticality and describing it as you play it out horizontally.
Hmm.
And he says that there's in this book, what he's trying to do, and this is fascinating, right? Because what he's trying to do is this is kind of towards, of course, he died midlife, but it's towards the end of his life. And he's realizing that in all of his previous work, there's something unaccounted for, right? That doesn't have a word that he's trying to put a word on.
Mm.
Um, and he's got to get underneath all of the axiomatic things, right, and get right down to the very visceral, right, of looking at the world, right, in some sense, and kind of come bring it out from there, and then continually finding yourself habitually doing this thing. Like, this book is him describing that happening, but the word he comes to he comes to is he calls it ontological flesh,
Hmm.
which is really interesting. And it's basically, he says, yeah, there hasn't been a word for this. And I started to realize, like, actually, if you think about this, as he's basically taking what would be from a horizontal, like, through time view, right, of pure relationality. How would that manifest itself? And it's interesting that he uses the word flesh, right? Because he's saying about this is the basic, this is our kind of basic way of comporting ourselves ontologically in the world, or being comported, right? Is this sense where he kind of talks about the when you touch your hand, right? You can, at some sense, you can, your right hand, you can feel how it's touching your left hand, right? And your left hand is the sensor, and your right hand is the sensed. But then again, then you can actually reverse it, and it's this other way where the other hand becomes the sensor and the sensed, and that there's this reversibility that can go back and forth, right? Where the touch, right, is where the touch is also touched, and this kind of sense of reversibility. And then he shows that's how it happens at every single level of being, is this reversibility, this contactfulness, right? That has this sense of going back and forth. And there's something about this sense of faith that you're unearthing, and this sense of flesh, right? Now, he says, of course, what he's pointing to is not a substance, right? It's not, it's it's ontological, right? So it's not a thing that you can feel. He says it's it's more like the old elements were, right? Like air, fire, worth. Like, it's more like one of those things, right? Where it's this intermediate kind of concept that it brings with it a certain style. And but there's this kind of way where he's getting at this already finding oneself already in contact, right, with the world, right? Where even my own invisibility, right, is the inexhaustible depth of the very thing seen. And in some sense, I'm like, when I'm looking out of the ocean, it's like I got to say that yes, there's me seeing the ocean, and then there's the also this way that where the ocean's seeing me, right? And like, even the sense of extending out into the world in some sense requires my own anonymity in that sensing. Yet the moment someone else comes along, right, and they see me, I reverse with them, and then the seer, I become one of the people in the frame. But that latent sense of being the seer was still substantiated, right, invisibly in the visible. And so he's basically kind of trying to talk through this way of this profound sense of intimacy that we can't ever even get out of, right, with the world, right? And I think that there's really something there in the way that you're talking about this contact with reality and this faithful sense of reality. And he even uses a phrase in that he kind of starts out the book with what he calls perceptual faith, right? is kind of the fundament that we find ourselves in. And he kind of goes into articulate this kind of perceptual faith that we have. But this deep already, because that's the sense I get, right? Is and this is also comes out in this sense of where I was talking about before of this remembering, right? Of like I find myself desiring, right? And my desire takes me into something, and then I remember what I was really desiring once it shows itself to me, which in some sense, right, kind of is a truing up for desiring the right thing, right, in some way. So just this sense of contactfulness and this kind of way of like when you're talking about this like grounding ourselves in the eternal, right? If we walk that forward, right, how does that show up in the display, right, of the horizontal?
Yeah, the thing that I'm noticing is like there's two words that are coming up. One is continuity
Yeah,
or wholeness.
yeah,
And then the other is, well, it's not a word, but the notion of, let's just go with a very simple first person versus third person.
yeah,
And so if we're centered in the eternal, and then of course we are also very much in the chronological,
yeah,
what we will notice is the chronological will begin to hang together.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Because we will begin to be coming in relationship. Oh, here's an example that I ran into a little while back. I think it was Dallas Willard was the theologian who put it into my head. But he made a very important point, which is that we moderns have come to a sort of a blasé notion that we can have a retcon of our own life story. If I hadn't X then.
yeah,
Think about what that implies. What that implies is that we relate to our own story in a third person relationship, an editorial function.
yeah,
We are not actually who we are, the
yeah,
actual us that couldn't be at all, like 0%, if even an iota of what had was not. Right? We are somehow some idealized projection of some editorial function that is actually not us at all, that
yeah,
is able to engage in this sort of purely imaginary um, uh, play with our timeline, with our lives.
yeah, yeah,
And that situation in this projection, in the situation in this simulation of ourselves, um, and the difficulty of what it takes for us to actually recenter ourselves in ourselves who
yeah,
are here, right? Notice that the present chronologically is also the moment eternally.
mm,
That's that the cross to
yeah,
the chronological and the eternal to be situated on that moment is that's the struggle, right? The struggle of moving from that third person default into a truly fully embodied, but
yeah,
now an embodiment that when you're centered in the eternal, you now have this increasing both awareness, remembering, a notion of communion, a notion of, wait a minute, I'm actually part of a whole. I'm and a connected part of a whole, not just an atom that happens to be part of an aggregate, but in
yeah,
fact part of a body,
yeah,
part of a wholeness. And the unfolding of that wholeness in chronology is fully governed by the characteristics of the eternal. And so therefore it starts to be, oh, I see, like things are, what is unfolding is unfolding in a way that isn't
yeah,
haphazard, it's not random, it's actually uh, connected. There's a continuity to it.
yeah.
So when I think about some like, please go ahead.
No, I said, yeah, I'm just bringing that term back. It hangs together.
It hangs together. Yeah. So when I think about folks in that mid-century moment, like people like, I guess Merleau Ponty's a little earlier, but of that same group,
Yeah,
um, I think they were very much struggling to reclaim
yeah,
that moment, right? That embodied moment.
definitely.
Uh, and have been, and we're weirdly enough, like because we're not in a functional secular culture, right? Our
Yeah,
secular culture is falling apart in every direction, and all of the mental constructs that have were sort of like so glorified in the turn of the century, the turn of the last century, not this one,
yeah,
has sort of so obviously played themselves out
right.
for better and for worse, by the way. I mean, they played themselves out in a way that, okay, there was something going on there that wasn't a complete error, but also they
Yeah.
could never have actually delivered on anything like the promise that they usurped for themselves.
Yeah.
Um, we're at least like meaningfully liberated from the struggle that they were facing. Like
Yeah.
our ability to step back into
Yeah.
on, to really put on our cross, to step into that loci
Yeah.
with and the chronological are unified, and
Yeah.
then to be moved from that place requires less individual works of genius,
Yeah.
like more like Ponty or Heidegger and guys like that,
Yeah.
but rather simply a remembering, a
Yeah.
surrender into the communion that's always already been on offer.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally. Totally. And it's interesting because I'm thinking about that sense of just hanging together, right? So if I'm standing in the eternal, right, which is the present moment, and I'm looking out, right, horizontally at my life, right, there's there's a way where there's all kinds of different ways I can be with that, right? And that from where I see the eternal in the temporal is in the way it hangs together, right? Like it sounds like the first thing is to notice that it's all hanging together, right?
Yeah.
And it's to mine that, to yeah, in some sense, is to, it strikes me that this is something like, the the notion of the way that, I mean, pretty much all the religions talk about, right, reading the sacred text, right? There's all these different levels,
Mhm.
right, in which that you can read, and that, like, reading um isn't measuring the shapes of the letters, right, and then tracking the patterns through those shapes, right? No, you're reading, right? There's something else, like you're participating in some sense, and but there's also this way where, by the way, like the other book that was wrote was like nature. The other book that
Yeah.
was written was like the world, right? All of this is in some sense a sacred text, right? In which we can become more and more proficient readers, right? And I get this sense that there's something, I get more of a handle at that, a more visceral, embodied sense of that when I think about looking at time, right, and the way my life is unfolding, and minding or reading, right, the way it's hanging together, and just that sense of, like, there's different levels, right, and different readings that you can have of that, and increasing depths of that reading.
All right. Yeah. So I'm mindful of the fact that I need to move on, but let me
Okay, yeah,
kind of give just a little bit to what you just said because it lit something up for me. So part of one of the things that just came through is this notion of we can cultivate it, we can craft a narrative
yeah,
and take the events of my life as I recall them, and I can craft a narrative that has them hanging together as part of a story.
yeah,
And of course, from a postmodern perspective, we can, at least at first blush, think, well, we can craft any narrative. We can craft an arbitrary narrative. There's no constraint. Um, but then we, of course, notice that actually has a perfectly nihilistic location, because
yep,
then that also means no narrative, right?
yeah,
The dominant narrative ultimately becomes the negation of all narratives as having anything other than pure arbitrariness.
yeah,
Um, but what you notice when you actually step away from when you metanoia, right? You step away from uh, an orientation that is governed by the logic of chronology or by propositional knowledge in that direction, and you recenter in the eternal, it all hangs together. It actually hangs together
yeah,
because there is something that constrains those stories and which gives us guidance and orientation on how to be in relationship with our story, is a part of a larger story all
yeah,
the way up.
yeah, 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 yeah. Really good talking with you, my friend.
Yeah, good talking with you
Wonderful.
too.
It's been
Um,
wonderful.
blessings on your family.
Thank you. Here's as well. All
All
right.
right.
We'll talk soon.
Bye.